Hey everybody, this is Richard and welcome to another episode of Fatal Error. This show began as a research project for me to understand how entrepreneurs and founders think about the climate emergency and figure out ways in which all organizations, not just non-profits, can become climate positive. Today's guest is Julian Harris, technologist and advisor at almond.org. Julian is on a mission to make use of technology to help combat climate change. In this episode, we talk about his personal journey that took him from academia to professional software development work through to educating himself on climate matters. Let's hear what he has to say. Well, let's just start with that. So I looked at your, when I looked at your LinkedIn profile last, your headline is that you're using cutting edge tech to help save the planet. So I guess, what does that mean, right? What's your involvement with tech? What's your background? What are you doing now? The brief version, but the complete version as well.
Yeah, so I've been very fortunate to having worked with internet technology since the early 90s. And from there, I've always been interested and greatly inspired to look at how people can be better through technology. And so that marriage of people and technology has always been a theme of mine. And, excuse me, just an ice cream, I have to clear my throat. And so I'm from New Zealand, where I was a research assistant at the university that I graduated. And then I lived in the UK for a little bit, and in Spain as well for about 3 years, and then settled in the UK. So I'm now here since 2003.
Oh, okay, that's quite a long time then.
Yeah, with a brief interlude in Bristol. And so what that's always driven me, like, as a way of being able to amplify my effectiveness. So one thing to help one person, but technology is this really exciting opportunity to be able to touch the lives of millions of people. So for that foundation, I've always been interested in projects that can help that. And in my journey, I've been working usually with kind of cutting edge or emerging technologies. That's where I've been most interested.
And so when you say working with, are you, at core, you're like an engineer, computer scientist? What's your, core skill, I suppose, if you want to put it?
Yeah, core skill as a programmer. So I've been a programmer that has always been interested in designing front ends into customer experiences or user experiences. So I've always been more interested in what I can do to build a piece of technology that people interact with, rather than clever things that work at the back end. And as such, I've been focusing therefore on user experience elements, and more recently other aspects such as behavioral science, understanding language and communication, design. So I'm quite interested in the visual side, quite interested in interactive components. And with that, then I've found myself looking at the impact of machine learning and AI on that space. And typically this has translated into being a kind of product designer, product manager with a technical
background, right? With a technical shift, yeah.
With a technical background, but then allows me to harness that opportunity and to know if you're going to build a product that takes advantage of some emerging tech, then it's a really good idea to.
And so what do you do? What do you do now? What's your current role, I suppose?
Yeah. So at the moment, right now, I'm the update that I shared recently was that I've been appointed as a product and technology advisor for a company called Almond, and they are wanting to expand their proposition. They're a sustainability company. They're wanting to help individuals live more sustainably. And the opportunity that's looking very healthy for them is expanding into the B2B enterprise space,
Okay.
where
Well,
you've
so
got.
just to take a step back, what do they do exactly?
Yeah, so at the moment they've got an app called Almond, which
Mhm.
allows you to uh, do sustainable things. To be honest, I haven't looked at their app for some months. I did an assessment of it recently. The reason why I was engaging with them is because of their new area that they're going to be focusing on, which is
Mhm.
allowing them, in this case, to, at its simplest, have plant a tree as a service. So imagine that you've got a large organization and you want people to make it easy for people, customers, or employees to be able to make an impact,
Uh-huh.
then having a technical interface to a fulfillment chain for being able to do good things, such as planting trees or other natural assets, then
Okay.
that's a pretty interesting interface. And so they've started. That's where their growth is, and they're looking to expand, and they have interest from all sectors and all parts of the
So
world.
do they plant trees on your behalf, or do they get them planted for you by somebody else? Are they sort of a middleman,
Yeah,
essentially?
yeah. It's a technology company that has
Okay.
come up with a model for brokering the procurement of natural assets on behalf of enterprises. So concretely, what this does is that there's a quality component to that, which is there's a science board validating the integrity and the impact of the providers they're using, and so they
Mhm.
have a growing set of providers that allow them to not only say plant a tree, but actually have, for a specific situation or a service for a particular client, have a bundle of services and of natural assets, which then can be brought together into a diversity package.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
for instance, what's exciting to me is that diversity element, because it's one thing to say I'm going to plant a million trees, but what does it really do? But if it's like, well, if this combination of there's one client in Spain, and so they want a Spanish tree of some kind, and they want some other things, and then the package says, well, when that group plants say a million trees, then you've saved the habitat of one crocodile, for instance, right? So
Okay.
yeah,
Which sounds small, right? One crocodile, even a million trees sounds small when we're talking about sort of on a global scale, I suppose. But I guess they're going for scale themselves, right?
yeah, exactly. That's the exciting thing for me. That's why I've got
Okay.
very interested in working with them is that you need to me, it's a really interesting signal, as you say, that you're like, well, is that worth it? And the answer is, well, this is just a good indication of the absolute enormity of the challenge that we all have. And for me to be part of a production line that enables millions of trees and therefore crocodiles to be saved, it's a pretty exciting way of being able to use my skills, I think.
Okay, so let's go into that a little bit because this is one of the things that interests me. So, how does somebody who is, a researcher, an academic, maybe a professional, like yourself, because you sort of seem to have done a bit of everything in a way, right? Well, not everything, but you had the sort of academic experience and then sort of working in professional software development environments. How was that? What got you to sort of worry that much or be interested that much in climate, um, that you wanted to shift, that you've shifted, I suppose, your focus, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I've always been interested. I mean, this stuff obviously has been bubbling away for
Sure. I mean,
time.
it's
I
been
remember
decades now, right? Yeah.
yeah, well, I mean, I remember as a child, I remember a pop-up book called SOS Save the Earth, which was a really interesting book. They were talking about like, mid 70s. This book was one of my favorites because it talked about pollution and to
Right.
air pollution and water pollution and all these kinds of pollutions. And I remember that and made an impact in terms of awareness. But as a child, I wasn't in an environment that necessarily spurred that into any form of action. And then, of course, decades of disinformation meant
Mm-hmm.
that most people ignored it. The difference that happened recently, I mean, I've been in the background aware of it. And I remember one other thing I did is I had about, I would say maybe 15 years ago, I created a Google saved search on extreme weather and
Okay.
looking at that. And I remember just setting it and to see when that had turned up on the news. And for years and years and years, there was really nothing, no mention of it. And there's obviously two factors: people reporting on it, and it actually happening. So there's two factors. But what was striking clearly was in the last 5 years, that term extreme weather has just gone through the roof. So there was an interesting background longitudinal exercise, pretty anecdotal, not really of any real statistical merit, but to me it was another signal. And all of these things combined, plus also having young kids, thinking about the future. I think a lot about the future because now I have kids, and I've been thinking a lot about the future of education.
That comes up, doesn't it? Or rather, not as in, it's a factor. It's like people who have kids sort of tend to think about this through the eyes of I don't mean, sometimes it sort of comes across as though it's like, I don't mean it as a value judgment of whether it's good or bad to have kids or anything, but it does sort of, for me at least, it sort of intensified some feelings as well, right? Sort of thinking about what are these kids going to have to deal with in the future? How are they going to, what's the pop-up book they're going to be reading in a few years' time?
That's a great way of putting it. I do think that there's something about, I think human nature, we're not actually very good planners. I don't think we think about the future. I don't think it's really, to think about anything more than what's right in front of us requires discipline and training and a whole sort of ethical framework to really think about the future.
Yeah.
Having experienced that as a project manager and other roles that involve anything to do with not now but sometime in the future, it's an upward battle. Like, it's just, people don't really naturally think about the future at all. Careers too. I did a lot of research when I was working at government on future of work. And I remember interviewing a guy who'd done a massive amount of research for 10 years on career development, because that was what they were trying to do. And I remember him saying, quite frankly, this was now 5 years ago, he was saying, quite frankly, no one really thinks about their career. They don't care. Most people are used to the next opportunity, if there is one, just turning up on their lap. So future and the idea of time management fundamentally is really not something that most cultures can deal with. And I think there's probably some that are better than others, but by and large is pretty poor.
And to steal a comment from one of my other sort of guests, it's, this climate issue is sort of further complicated by the fact that even if it is in the here and now, it very often isn't necessarily in your backyard, right? So the stuff that might be having a negative impact on your climate, on a global climate, by actions you're taking now, the sort of the feedback loop can be very far away. It could be happening at the other side of the planet. So you think everything's fine because actually things look fine here, It's a tiny bit warmer for a couple of days a year. It's not such a big deal.
For sure. I mean, no one cares about polar bears on shrinking ice.
It's too far away, It's too remote. Most people wouldn't even think of even ever visiting, It's okay. But we were talking about how you moved into the climate space, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, to finish that point, you said that the making things locally relevant is really key. But what's been interesting as also a data point is how collectively different parts of the world have responded to COVID-19. I mean, that's been very, very interesting. Here in the UK, you've got Brexit and COVID-19. I think we've got a generational issue. I think we've got a generation that I'm part of, that we've grown up post-war pretty damn comfortable. We've grown up with prosperity for most people. Obviously there's real hardship for a lot of people, but for a lot of people, it's just stuff's just been, bed of roses territory. I certainly can say that from my own experience. I've been exceptionally privileged and lucky in my life, right down to, having the right gender and skin color. Honestly, that's just the reality. But there's other things, and when I say right, I mean as all the biases.
I understood what you mean. Yeah.
So
the lucky draw sort of is what you mean by right.
I mean, there's the kind of classic adage is like, to become successful, step one, be born to the right parents.
Exactly.
That's there is something to be said about that. And with that, then I think I've certainly been in a community around the world of the knowledge workers, which have seen incredible prosperity. And if we look at the quality of life that
Mm-hmm.
people have had with really no effort on their part for the last, 30, 40 years, it's just got better by and large in many, many respects. And that is a generational experience of things just work out. And so you have this foundational cultural outlook of it'll be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, again, this is very Western and very this and that. I mean, there's
Sure.
a large number of places in the world where that's absolutely not the case. But by and large, in my community, in the world I've grown up in, the world that a large portion of the UK have, it's just, and New Zealand too, it's just been that. And so as a result, this idea of needing to do anything other than that and get out of being comfortable and getting out
Mm-hmm.
of a habit that of doing things that make you less comfortable, that requires an exceptional amount of effort. And there's that great quote which says that it's very hard to make a man understand something when their very income relies on them not understanding it.
Yes, I saw that somewhere recently, and it's just sort of.
I posted on LinkedIn, yeah.
I wonder if it was you then, because yeah, okay. But yeah, it's true. I mean, it's we've seen that, I suppose, with almost anything from fishing to farming. If however much you sort of, I grew up. So I live in Scotland now, where I'm from Malta originally, so I grew up in the Mediterranean kind of fishing environment and so on. And I remember these conversations about overfishing, right? Still going on, but at the time in the 90s, tuna fishing, overfishing there, depleting the stocks, and also in other parts of the Mediterranean, kind of the dynamite fishing approach, right? Which for somebody like me, who I suppose, as you were saying, is sort of from a privileged standpoint, is like, it's pretty obvious if you keep bombing the shit out of everything, well, it's all going to go away. But
Yes, yeah.
I suppose for the people doing it, or some of them, it was like you said, it was at odds with their livelihood. So they didn't want to understand. I can understand that now, with a little bit of hindsight, how that was a hard thing. But so you were saying it's a generational thing. So do you think the younger generations are going to have a different experience then? So was that?
Without question. Yeah.
In what are you imagining in your head? Sort of like, what have you thought about? Sorry, the reason I ask is because one of the things that people sort of, one of the things that comes up with climate change topics is a lot of people don't really know what to even think, like in terms of how urgent or catastrophic, something of the sort could be. So you've got, like a spectrum of people where at one end you're like, everything's fine, right? It'll fix itself. And on the other end, maybe you've got people who are like, well, we're screwed. We're dead, in a couple of years, a couple of decades time, right? And I suppose the way you behave is affected by where on that spectrum you fit, So is it like, well, we're going to be, our kids are going to be kind of inconvenienced, they should think about where to buy real estate. Or is it more of, well, our kids actually risk dying, like where's your head at?
I just refer to William Gibson's famous quote, which is that the future is here, it's just not very evenly distributed. And it's the same with climate change, right? So you've got right now, you have millions of people being affected by the impact of climate change now, and they are suffering.
Okay,
and,
who do you mean, or what kind of thing do you mean?
Some of the low-lying islands in the ocean. So there's climate refugees where they're being flooded because the water levels have already risen. You've also got other things that are happening all over the place, because so that's pretty concrete. And then you've got other things such as extreme weather just making it difficult for people to live, or their homes being destroyed at an increasingly intense scale. And you've got droughts and you've got floods, all these kinds of things. Everything's becoming more extreme, and the infrastructure to support that and sustain it is generally not is there for a bit, but typically can't deal with a sustained, ongoing kind of shake up like is happening. So your first point around the the spectrum of like where people sit. You know, I've been all over that spectrum, and experiencing and sitting in that position of like hopelessness or feeling it's fine. I've gone through all of that as my journey. To answer a question you raised prior to the earlier around how I got here, there was a tipping point, I think, with Greta's September climate strike last year in 2019, where I was in a position where I'd been thinking for some time about a new kind of opportunity. I was working in an AI startup where I was getting some great skills and experience working with machine learning, deep learning, conversational AI, natural language processing. And for various reasons, I was thinking about how to, what the next step was going to be. I actually had a plan to use those skills in a product role for some time. And so in the summer break, I took some time off to think about these things. And when the climate strike came out, I think it was the September 24th or something like that.
Thereabouts. I don't remember exactly, but something like that.
What was interesting for me was, I remember thinking, I'm not really a placards guy necessarily, but maybe I can do something. Maybe I can do something. Maybe I can do something with my skills. And so I did two things. One is I asked across my community, like, what do people do in technology who want to help combat climate change? So I first did that kind of broadcast across my community and got a few links to different places like Impact Makers, you mentioned. There was also Climate Action Tech as well. There was Tomorrow and a few others. And that was awesome. And climateaction.tech is a great one as well. It's a very active community of more than 2,000 people now, where it's about people who aren't necessarily technology practitioners, but they're interested in the impact of technology specifically and how it can help. But there's a massive amount of engagement and expertise in that community, which is really great. And I recommend it for anyone who wants to, learn more and get access to great expertise who's happy to help. So, and the first part was look at the communities, because I was thinking if there isn't one, I'll create one, but I don't want to unless there's a need. And the second one was like, well, let me learn more about it. And that was a pretty unpleasant journey for sure. That was.
Hey, well, tell me more a bit about that, because a lot of people say they had an unpleasant journey in this in this space, and they're not all the same kind of journey. But so, first of all, where did you go to learn about this stuff, right? Because
I just searched online.
Okay.
I mean,
okay, sure, online, but like any particular, were you reading books? Was it, expert interviews, The Guardian? What are we talking about here? Because
I honestly don't remember. It was a mixture of the standard Google search stuff. So it would have been some articles. It would have been news, and it would have been some YouTube videos. I remember two things of note that others can then follow. One is that there are some really good articles that explain what's going on. There's a really great couple of explainers, and we can put those in the show notes. Links to a very, very friendly introduction to climate change. So it's not, it's not like doom and gloom. It's like, this is what's going on. And the essence of one of those that I really enjoyed was, we put a whole bunch of carbon into the atmosphere. We need to put it back in again. Really quite straightforward.
Yeah, I was writing something recently as a sort of proposal for something, and when you get down to it, it's actually quite a simple problem, simple to understand, right? It's we can live here because the carbon's been taken out over a number of millennia, and now we're putting it back. We're putting it back in the atmosphere, right? So we need to just put it back in the ground or somewhere. It's a sort of very simple problem statement, right?
Yeah, I liked it.
So why is it so hard for people?
It doesn't want to go on the ground. It just doesn't naturally go there. So to me, I really like education. I like figuring out ways of communicating things that help people move from where they are to the direction I'm hoping they'll go. And their simple statement, like, we put a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, we need to put it back in again into the ground, is a really nice, simple one. And, then because the right kind of statement provokes a bunch of questions like yours, such as, well, how do you get it in? It's like, well, and how do you stop producing it, for instance, and things like that. and that's taken me on a journey. So the things that got me engaged were news articles and podcasts. And so the things that my journey was, I think, a little bit of foundational education, but I didn't do any qualification stuff because I was impatient. I just wanted to get it. I wanted to digest things in a different form.
Yeah.
So what I started doing is fire hosing climate news, which was really hard. And I remember feeling pretty depressed about it and asking the climate action community, like, what do people do? And the answer was, well, don't read the news. And I thought, well, that's fine, but I still want to keep up to date. So how do I deal with that? And my solution to that was doing a bit of curation. And I've actually went back to a tool that I used many years ago called Flipboard. And Flipboard is it's a reader tool, and I created some feeds where I search terms like climate change and blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff. And I created some what are called Flipboard smart magazines, which have these terms and related terms. And so what I started doing is filtering that, and then what I'd create is some additional downstream magazines, one called Climate Hope and one called Climate Hopelessness. And so when I skim through, I would bucket them like that. So I would put a link.
She escaped from lunch.
Well,
it's still early for lunch, but
yeah, gotcha. Some kind of morning snack. Yeah. So so that's been kind of the way that I have tried to make something constructive out of it, and so I still curate that actually. So I can send a link to the climate.
Well, that would be great if they're publicly shareable. Yes, please do. That would be great.
Yeah. And there is some good stuff going on. And what I think was the reason it was created was because I wanted people to be able to keep engaged with the conversation and have hope. And this idea of hope is critical to a foundation of the future, a positive future, to have hope. It's funny, I was just watching a Jane Goodall documentary yesterday, plus an interview with her and Dr. Jane Goodall with Tim Ferriss. And I've known her obviously for years, but that interview was really timely because it reminded me what's important now. And she just said it's about hope. And she says the way that that's done is by touching people's hearts. And that's through stories. And I realized that part of the Climate Hope feed is to continue this ongoing story of the great things that are being done. Because my view is that there's a certain group of people who are engaged, and that it's almost like there's a section of people or a group of people or a community of people that that want to engage, but they get really discouraged by all the negative news. And so I'm trying to find ways of being able to filter that.
Okay.
So
that's a big issue. That's come up in a few of the conversations we've had, which is that it's a very at best it's an up and down topic to be kind of engaged in, right? Because I think it's impossible to be properly following the climate news or being involved somehow in the community without at certain probably regular points being pretty down or depressed about the whole thing, because it's I suppose it's like maybe working in an ER or something like that. The best analogy I can come up with from stories I've heard. It's sort of maybe you're doing good or something like that, but it's very hard to see the news, right? Seeing the sort of the numbers going the wrong direction, or see people suffering in some cases.
It's really interesting you bring up ER, because when I was going to some of these meetups pre-COVID-19, it occurred to me that there are, as you say, a community of people who business as usual, it's crisis as usual. So those who are in accident and emergency, those who are in who are firefighters, and so I actually did some outreach, and I connected with a few firefighters.
Okay.
ask them, like, would you like to talk in the climate community about how you deal with the fact that your job is crisis as usual? So we have some models of people who do it already in other areas.
That's an interesting. I'd never thought of that
I can
actually.
introduce you to
Yeah.
some a couple of firefighters who would love to talk about that on this podcast if you want.
Yeah, no, please do. That would be great. And just thinking about it as you were saying, and thinking there's probably loads more of people who deal with this stuff. So crisis as usual is the term used, which I love. Like therapists, for example, are constantly dealing with people's terrible sort of experiences, emotions, blah blah blah,
Yeah.
of varying degrees. But still, I suppose nobody goes to a therapist because they're happy.
Yeah, that's true. Therapists, mediators, bunch of people who deal with crisis as usual.
Yeah, family lawyers, I suppose, things like that. Very few people go to family lawyers because they're having a sort of a good family situation,
Yeah, that's true.
Never thought about that. It's very easy to become kind of very introverted about the whole thing and think, oh, nobody else experiences this kind of problem, but it's obviously not the case. I guess people who deal with kind of abuse or things like that, where sexism and sort of other kind of forms of discrimination deal with this stuff.
It's true as well.
Crisis is usual on a day in, day out basis for many people who sort of face that kind of discrimination, I suppose.
Yeah,
okay. So let me I don't want to stretch this out too long. And I did want to have like one, but there was one thing I really wanted to ask you about, because you're a sort of a tech person by for a number of decades, right? And you're talking a lot about tech, as do I, by the way. It's not a criticism, but like tech communities, tech solutions to this, that, and the other. And I suppose there's this problem in my head, which is that it's sort of tech which created the problem in the first place, right? Like in a lot of ways, without technology, you wouldn't be emitting carbon, right?
You mean machinery?
I mean technology in the broad sense of the word. Like, so I'm talking like from industrial revolution all the way through now, with like,
yeah.
I mean, the web, the fact that we're having this podcast is all dependent on energy production and consumption, which in the majority, I mean, most likely this call is emitting fossil fuel, sort of is being powered by a fossil fuel rather than a renewable energy source,
Might. We don't know, but yeah.
But the likelihood is, because at the moment the majority of our infrastructure isn't powered by renewable sources. So, how do we, how do we balance that? Like, so I see like a lot of people in tech don't like to talk about it. In software, for example, they feel like, well, software is cool, it's good, it's clever. People don't like to acknowledge the dark side, maybe, of the web. There's some statistics which show the web having a carbon footprint as large or larger than aviation, for example.
Yeah, about 2%.
Right. So, what is the answer here?
I think there's different things. I think part of it, in terms of what people do, if we take a spectrum, the simplest thing to do is, for someone as a technologist, is to look for your next job in a company that's actually doing good. So it's just make sure that you don't work for an oil company next, for instance. You can go for a company that's going green. Like, there's a lot of companies, Microsoft doing some pretty impressive things. So aligning your skills to a company whose philosophy is aligned with yours is that's a really simple no-brainer, I think.
Okay, that's fair enough. Yes. Okay.
From there, it gets more involved, and depending on the nature of the person, then it's more about what that individual can do, and then there's non-technical aspects, the human aspects. Everyone here who's listening who is a technologist is also a human, and mostly. So there might be some bots, but hey, as a result, the human side is new, and that's often uncomfortable. Because there's an element of saying, well, what brings meaning to my life outside of my work, and what can I do as a person? And that is about community. There's elements of activism and about leading with best practice, acknowledging fundamentally, and I think this is an important, simple takeaway, that if someone says it's just me, there's no point, they're forgetting that they're in a community no matter what they do. And their actions may or may not have a direct impact on other people, but there's a good chance that, I mean, there's a zero chance of impact if you don't do anything, but there's a non-zero chance that if you do something and model good behavior, that you will impact.
Well, that sounds like one of those things which sounds, you know, sort of like it's a nice sound. I don't disagree with you, but it's like it's a nice sound bite, right? But it's true. If you don't do anything, there's a zero chance of anything changing, right? Or any impact rather of your from your action. But what is the most impactful thing, right, that you can do in a, you know, whether you're a small company or whether you're a sort of one tiny cog in a larger company? Sure, you can align yourself with a company that is maybe already aligned with your goals, but let's say that most companies aren't, right? Or even if they're not most, but there are some large ones which aren't. There's plenty of small ones which aren't. What do you do, right? How do you you've spoken to a lot of people in the community, in your research and so on. How do you bring this up, right?
Well,
in an organization, for example, that is full of geeks focused on code, you know?
Well, I think you know, I think it's important to accept that the audience that I'm engaging with is going to have various levels of engagement. That spectrum you painted, some of them are not going to be interested in doing anything. There's, you know, I have a very good friend of mine who just says, I'm just going to rely on you and people like you to solve the problem. I have no interest in solving the problem. I mean, he's quite upfront about it. It's just not a priority for me. I've got other things in my life that's more important. And that's a legitimate position. There's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. That's a position in some cases where, you know, someone's just so busy with their family life and paying the bills that they don't have any more time.
Well, that was my position until a few years ago. It was like, somebody will fix it. I'm sure somebody will fix it, you know?
Yeah, and that's why I'm saying the easiest thing to do is to look at jobs, like when you're looking for a new job. So you brought up a point, which is, let's assume that someone isn't changing jobs anytime soon because it's not practical, right? Imagine, for instance, you know, all of those people, many very, very bright and talented people who are in the middle of their expertise is in something to do with oil and gas or something, right? Let's just take that example. Mm-hmm. So what do they do? Well, there's a number of things. Inside those organizations, there's generally a sustainability component, generally. Very few companies now have no sustainability at all. In fact, those companies, let's just segment it into, there's opportunities for people to be able to contribute and want potentially engage in some way in that other area of the business. So that's something they can do. You know, lots of case studies in the climate action tech community meetups where people have done this, where they bootstrapped, you know, entire new activity inside the company, really off the back of some ideas or projects. So being a programmer in the daytime doesn't mean that you can't necessarily do other things. And the company could potentially be a place where you can impact a lot of people. If you are influencing, you know, policy on the company, then that can influence on how the company itself manages waste, for instance. Right. You know, that's a pretty big footprint that you can then, you know, link to and associate yourself with. That's not to do with technology, but it may be to do with technology because you know about it and say, well, you know, like for instance, it might be that when it comes to, if they have a very strong e-commerce presence, then it might be that what you can be an advocate for internally is being educated on the Green Web Foundation stuff. So there's a bunch of technologies that are greener, and also being aware of simple things, such as, you know, again, in terms of action, sometimes the action can't be, there are prerequisites to that action, and sometimes there's a time limit to that action. So for instance, a good example of that is I did some research. I forget why, but I decided that I wanted to learn more about the performance. I think it's because my programming background, it bugs me that very popular languages like Python are incredibly inefficient. And so I came across a research paper that showed the actual CPU and execution time of a very wide range of benchmarks across about 30 languages. And the outcome of this was kind of obvious, but it was great to have numbers behind it. And it just showed that a language like Golang or Swift or these compiled languages, Java, even actually JavaScript in a lot of cases because its JIT compiler is very good, was vastly,
Okay.
vastly more efficient than Python. So what I'm getting to here was that knowing the fact that if you rewrite this Lambda function in Golang, you're going to not only be 25 times faster, but you're going to probably use about 4% of the resources than Python.
Yeah.
And so my view is that in some situations it's going to be appropriate to say we're going to do it because that's what we want to do and it's better. But being informed with that in the background of making a decision like what language do we use, if it doesn't matter, use a greener language, and it's also going to be cheaper.
Right, and very often it doesn't matter, right? I mean, I don't mean every time, and sometimes it matters, but programmers are really good at learning new things. I suppose it's finding the incentive to do that, right?
The incentive comes from that journey of awareness and understanding that this is a problem and what can I do, and aligning that with what they do day to day.
Have you learned a new language or switched something because of this? So, for example, because you mentioned Python, for example, which is always a favorite of mine when I was doing a bit more programming. Did you switch something?
Well, so...
No, I was going to say maybe not. It doesn't have to be like, oh, did you do it kind of thing. But, just curious if there's an experience.
So my journey to hands-on programming has only really been picked up in the last 6 months or so. Well, actually, now it's coming up a year. So my role has been really where I'm writing a lot of production code. So the volume of code I've been writing has been pretty low. And the work I've been doing has been mostly machine learning, where it's basically Python, right? So that said, there's two things. One is that, so my own direct impact, this is absolutely going to change how I think about how I scale my solution. So I'm working with, okay, this is an example of a function, and with functions as a service, like Cloud Functions, Lambda, all this kind of stuff. That's a nice way of being able to modularize it to some extent, right? So my plan is that I'm going to I'm prototyping this stuff in Python, so I know it all works well. But I'm almost certainly going to rewrite the parts either in Swift to be running on the client, or to be in probably Go or something much higher performance, cheaper in the back end. And the nice part is that I've refreshed my tech skills in the last year or so to understand the cloud space a bit better and how it relates to machine learning. And so that's given me the toolkit that now allows me to go, right, well, the first thing to do is the problem solvers, can it be done? And then the next stage is, can it be done efficiently? And then it can be done efficiently at scale. And those parts, when it comes, so it's an optimization, but if you're not thinking, to me, the ideal Magic Wand scenario is a company says, let's find a prototype in Python, right? But by default, you should be building your production services in Go because it's vastly greener. And when you have commercial incentives aligned with green,
well, and it's going to be faster, right? As well, for example, right?
And cheaper.
And cheaper, of course.
Yeah. And so my headline view on this stuff is that when commercial incentives align with green incentives, then it's going to naturally play out. In the machine learning space, there's been some projects to vastly improve the effectiveness and reliability and footprint of deep learning systems, particularly natural language processing.
Yeah.
And it's been driven by, people can't even access these tools because they're too processor intensive. And so there's natural optimization going on in the machine learning space, and in the programming space, there's going to be natural optimization when people go, well, this stuff on the website is being used all this time. How do we make it faster? Which means how do we make it greener? So when you have an alignment of we want to save costs, then the policy it would be nice to say, well, don't worry about the engineering cost of building it. Let's just look at the operational costs. So I would like to be in with sustainability office that says we've got a company objective to be greener, And so I have a budget to absorb the engineering cost to migrate that code to another one, so that you can then get a system that's going to be, even if it's the same speed, it's going to be lower cost. You know what I mean? So it's a
Yeah, yeah,
complex.
yeah.
The question's simple, but it's very context specific.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, listen, thank you very much for all this for all of the entire conversation. I think we can probably wrap it up there. For today, you could keep talking about this stuff for a very long time. Even just as you're saying this, like other questions pop up in my head. But
Yeah.
let's wrap it up there for today.
Okay.
So thank you very much. I'd love to get from you the links that you mentioned, some of the links that you mentioned. So especially the curated feeds, the Flipboard feeds that you mentioned, because I think those kinds of things can be very, I mean, for me, Frank, just, very
Yeah.
selfishly, like I'd love to see that myself. But,
Yeah.
we'll share it in the write-up as well. So,
Of course.
so I'd love to get those. And yeah, well, best of luck with Almond. I'd love to see how that goes, how that progresses over the next few months.
Well, thanks for having me on, Richard, and I'll look forward to hearing back from the community about and learning from your other guests as well.
Perfect. Thank you for listening. Please visit fatalair.blog to join our mailing list and help support our community and project. And if you like the music, please check out the Happy Quartet on Bandcamp. That's it for today.